Greetings. This is our June 10th lecture that is asynchronous, so we will not be meeting in class. I will walk through a few things about how we'd like to kind of weigh this out. This will be a two-part lecture series that I'll do that maybe will last 15 minutes for Chapter 6 and 15 minutes for Chapter 7. And so it'll be in two parts as I post it because my video software only does 15 minutes at a time. The journal entries are completed. Hopefully by the time you watch this, they will be graded. And you're welcome to offer any questions or check in with me if you have any thoughts on that first entry. The second piece of this is that we have an online discussion forum as part of this class, which will be graded. And so when you tap into my courses, you'll see that this is really an online discussion about the chapters 4 through 7. And so this is the second of the three-part OD process. And so how has this insight influenced your perspective on change and organizational effectiveness? And how can you use this insight in your work or organization? So really, I'm looking for your insight and your thoughts on what you have learned and how you can align it with your work experience or your personal experience to offer insight. And so post a thoughtful paragraph. It's not a 5-word paragraph. It's not a 40-word paragraph. It's probably a little bit longer. And just offer up your experience as a thoughtful paragraph. And then others will undoubtedly post on your paragraph. So you are responsible for another 2 responses to other people's posts. And your grade will be based on the quality of your response and some of the shared ideas that you exchange. So I've done this and find it to be a fairly effective way for everyone to learn from one another. So hopefully I'll post as well. And if you have any questions on that, please touch base with me before the assignment's due on the 10th. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into Chapter 6. Some of this may be a little glitchy. This is not rehearsed material, so I may fidget back and forth, so be patient with me. So the learning objectives are fairly well outlined at the front of the chapter. And really this looks at the relationship of the OD practitioner. Oftentimes whenever someone says we're going to bring in someone to help us with something, it sort of piques everyone's interest and anxiety to some extent about why are they here, who brought them in and who do they work for, what do they want and why. How do I know if they ask me anything that my confidentiality is going to be protected, and who's going to have access to the data and what's in it for the organization? So what are we going to get out of this? Is this intervention or organizational behavior for the month, or is this something that's going to be lasting and enduring? And how can I trust the practitioner? These are all sorts of things that certainly pop up in the context of working with an OD practitioner, whether it's internal or external. So just be mindful of that as you engage in that process. And so we can certainly talk more about that in class as we have time. But I think one of the big pieces of this is really how do we collect data and what types of data are there and how do we use it? And so that's what I'm going to spend just a little bit of time with you on, is really talking through a bit of that. So this chapter does a really good job of outlining that. You'll notice here on this cycle of data collection and feedback on the slides that I'll be posting prior to the lecture that you certainly establish the relationship. And again, that can be entering and contracting. And then you have the core activities, which are collecting the data, analyzing the data, and then offering feedback so that you bring it full circle with whoever sponsored the data collection in the first place, and then you follow up an action plan. So again, just like the OD general model of plan change, this should look very familiar to you by now at this point in the class, but we're just really focusing on the core activities of data collection. So I'd really encourage you to go see Table 6.2 on page 118. This is one of the annoying aspects of the book, is that I would just hope they would give me a pretty slide that shows all of this in a way that I can just post it on my deck, but they don't. They sort of make it more challenging than it needs to be. So you'll have to refer to it inside the book, but it really breaks it down into 4 different areas: questionnaires, interviews, observations, and unobtrusive measures or secondary data. And so with surveys and questionnaires, which is very popular, we talked a lot about the Likert scale. The major advantages are that we now have in OD a way to capture and quantify data on perception. And so the beautiful thing about it is that you can collect data from large samples, and the more data you have, the better, certainly from a quantitative standpoint, because it lowers your error and gives you more reliable and generalizable data. And that's just a real key thing in the parlance of research is how do I know that I have enough data so that I can apply this outside of just the context of one company, so that I can use it to make generalizations about other elements of organization development, whether it be culture or it be commitment to the organization. Maybe it's loyalty, maybe it's how people accept plan change, those types of things. And it's per person relatively inexpensive. Some of the challenges with it are that it gives you very little insight into the thoughts and feelings of people. There's not much empathy related to it. It's pretty static. There's no chance for follow-up questions typically in a meaningful way. And then sometimes the data is overinterpreted, and it can be used for the wrong purpose, and sometimes it might be a short-sighted purpose. And then response bias is always possible, because you just don't know what's going through someone's head when they clean out or when they're completing a survey. So here's an example in a survey context. This is one that I've done a few times, and I've created my own instrument for 360 feedback. And so you can take a look at this, but it's really controls his or her emotions during high pressure situations. Well, I would code that 1 through 5 on a Likert scale, from always to never. And so you've certainly seen this type of feedback survey, and this is very common in how we use it in making decisions about how we deal with and how we work with humans inside the workplace. Here's a feedback scenario where I've done a peer-rated evaluation on a 360, and I've put it in this context into 4 domains: teamwork, leadership, results orientation, and self-awareness. And so the questions are all laid out here. 1 is always, 5 is never in this particular scale. So you can see how the results show up in blue are all areas where they have a gap between the person that rated themselves, where it says self-rating, versus the average of all the other raters. And so in this sense, I might have had 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 other raters. And then what I would do is average those ratings and compare them to the person so that you can see where the differences are. And then I would offer feedback. And then the second page of this is actually where I ask them for verbatim feedback, such as, if you were mentoring this person, what kinds of things would you share with them to make them even more effective? So this is an example where I've done a qualitative survey with people to really dig into giving them some self-awareness about how others have perceived them and how they perceive themselves. And so that's a real effective way. And I'll talk about kind of giving feedback at the end of this particular lecture. And so interviews are another way to gather feedback. We can also call those sometimes focus groups. And so the major advantage is it is very, very adaptive and allows for you to customize your questioning and really dig deeper. So it gives you very rich data on a particular context or an element. Focus groups are very popular in any sort of marketing analysis where they're trying to test market something, but it's also really great when you're trying to get in and get some sense for how the culture shows up and what's on people's minds within an organization. So it builds rapport and empathy with the subjects, and so it gives you this opportunity to really create a relationship where people feel comfortable opening up and telling you more than they could on a quantitative survey, which is very objective. So in this case, we've got very subjective answers. Tell me a time when you noticed Billy really being his best. Tell me a time when Billy really didn't serve the group well? And those would be examples of questions that someone could ask in an interview context to help you get insight. Some of the potential problems are it is quite expensive on a per person basis because you've got someone who's a researcher sitting there across from someone for some period of time. And the more you do, the more expensive it gets. You certainly introduce biases in a certain way because of the interviewer's responses. So it's not quite as simple and straightforward as a quantitative assessment. And it's difficult to code and interpret. So you might have a tape recorder. If you have a tape recorder, you have somebody that is at risk because you don't know what's going to happen to that data once it leaves. You also have how do you code and interpret that in a way that's meaningful. And you also have self-report bias, where the person that's sitting across from you might, they certainly have their own take on things and stuff going through their mind, and they may bias what they share with you. So observations are the third approach to gathering feedback. And so this collects data on actual behavior rather than report. It is real time, which is awesome, and it is adaptive and objective. And so often I've been called in to just observe people in meetings or maybe spend half a day shadowing them in their workplace just to get a better, richer understanding of what the workplace and the environment's like. And that gives me a chance to offer them feedback because I'm able to see it much closer by walking around with them and almost shadowing them just to see what are some of the presenting issues or challenges that someone's facing that I can't gather over a coaching call on the phone. And so this is another common way to do data gathering. This is also known as ethnographic, which is you're embedding yourself in the culture to watch what's going on. So there's been some amazing books written on that context. And so we can certainly talk more about that. I have my own experience with ethnography. Some of the major problems that come along with it are coding and interpreting, sampling inconsistencies. It's not always easy to get the right people in the room at the same time. You may have bias of the observer, and the reliability of what that person interprets can be questionable. Because as we've talked before, when you're doing any kind of consulting, whether it's internal or external, you only see about this much of the big picture because you're just there for you're there for a short period of time. So it's really difficult to weigh judgment on something where you have 2 days and the situation's been in play for 10 years. And so that's a bit of a limitation. Furthermore, it can be expensive. So those are some of the things that pop up. Unobtrusive measures are really secondary data. They can be meeting minutes, field reports, that kind of thing. And so those are also certainly viable approaches to gathering information, but it's often not very reliable and really gives you a nice idea about what the context the situation, but it doesn't really tell you anything that you can see, touch, and feel with your own eyes, and it's not customized. So there's certainly some validity issues related to that. So sample size, the higher the sample, bigger the sample, the more reliable it is. There's different types of sampling. There's random sampling, and then there's stratified sampling. So if I just wanted to look at a particular demographic of a group, I would stratify my sample and look for ages 30 to 45, which is different than open random sampling. And then there's qualitative and quantitative tools. And unfortunately, I'm running out of time, but content analysis is an approach that you would use in qualitative tools where you do a lot of coding and field notes to understand some of the themes that pop up. Quantitative tools, you use descriptive statistics and correlation. Here's an example of correlation. I'll leave this on my slides. It's very common to use correlation with regard to anything, and correlations range from -1 to 1. And the closer it gets to 1, either way, the stronger the relationship. Force field analysis and work group performance. This is really Lewin's model turned up on a vertical axis. And so we can talk about this a bit too. I think this is a fascinating approach. So force field for change and maintaining the status quo is very, very common. And then effective feedback. It works great when you bring some compassion to the table and people are motivated to see the data. the meeting's structured in a way that is beneficial. Power and influence certainly play a role, and then the meeting's facilitated. So I'm going to sign off and start part 2 in just a moment.